Harry S. Truman had seen many kinds of men in Washington, some polished, some cunning, some hiding ambition behind a gentleman's smile. But none of them, not a single one, entered a room with the force of a thunderclap the way General George S. Patton did. And long before Truman became president, long before the Oval Office became his battlefield, he had quietly formed an opinion about Patton, an opinion he never intended to share openly. This story, drawn from diaries, private letters, and declassified war files, is not a tale of hatred, nor is it a story of admiration without limits. It is the complicated journey of two powerful American figures, one carrying the calm weight of political responsibility, the other roaring across Europe with the fire of an ancient warrior. And somewhere between them, history left behind pieces of truth that were never meant to be spoken aloud. The tension did not begin in the White House. It began much earlier, when Truman was still a senator from Missouri and Patton was already a legend in American armor. Truman watched him from a distance, reading reports, hearing testimonies, scanning newspapers filled with praise and outrage for the same man. The senator wrote once in a personal note, quietly, almost like a passing thought, "General Patton is not like the others. He is a man built for war, and that is both his strength and his danger." At the time, it seemed harmless. Patton was doing what Patton did best: training, driving, shouting, pushing his men to the very limit. He was carving a new kind of warfare in steel and oil, the kind America had never seen before. But Truman sensed something beneath the layers of medals and headlines, something few were willing to say out loud. Patton was not controlled by war. He thrived in it. And such a man, Truman believed, must always be watched carefully. Yet, even in those early days, there was a certain admiration. Truman, a veteran himself, respected courage. He respected discipline. And Patton embodied both with such ferocity that it seemed almost mythic. When America entered the Second World War, Truman had no illusions about who would carry the heaviest weight on the battlefield. Men like Eisenhower would coordinate it. Men like Bradley would stabilize it. But men like Patton would ignite it. And privately, Truman acknowledged that without Patton, the war in Europe would drag on much longer. Still, admiration is not trust. Respect does not mean comfort. And as the war stretched on, Truman's private files would quietly fill with notes, observations, and uneasy reflections on the most unpredictable general America had ever unleashed. The man Truman could not ignore. In 1944, when Truman was vice president under Franklin Roosevelt, he received briefings that most Americans would never know existed. Patton's name appeared repeatedly in reports of extraordinary victories, rapid advances, daring maneuvers, and then, in equally bold letters, reports of controversies, comments to the press, disciplinary issues, the infamous hospital incident. Each time, Truman read in silence. Each time, he wrote nothing. Each time, he turned the page with the same calm expression he used when discussing taxes or farm bills. But inwardly, Truman was forming an image of Patton that would become one of the most complicated judgments of his political life. He did not see a monster nor a rogue soldier. He saw a man who embodied the raw, unfiltered spirit of warfare. A man who belonged to the battlefield the way some men belong to poetry. Patton was brilliant, frighteningly brilliant. But brilliance alone, Truman believed, could not dictate the fate of a nation. Brilliance must answer to democracy, to rules, to something larger than personal glory. And there, deep inside Truman's quiet thoughts, the storm began forming. The war ends, but the fire does not. When Roosevelt died in April 1945, Truman inherited not just a country in the middle of a world war, but a roster of powerful generals with reputations larger than life. Yet no name demanded more immediate attention in his mind than George S. Patton's. The war in Europe ended only weeks into Truman's presidency. While the world celebrated, Truman read a classified assessment that chilled him. General Patton expresses dissatisfaction with Allied occupation policies and political decisions. Truman knew what that meant. Patton was not a man to whisper. He was a man of blunt honesty, the kind that cut through diplomacy like a blade through soft earth. It was admirable on the battlefield, dangerous off it. Truman had not even settled fully into the Oval Office. before the warnings began arriving. Sir, Patton may speak publicly. His views may contradict Allied policy. There could be political repercussions. Truman listened. He always listened. But he did not react emotionally. His approach to Patton was not rooted in fear or anger. It was rooted in responsibility. America had just won the largest war in human history. The world was fragile. Any misstep could shatter everything the Allies had sacrificed for. And somewhere in the middle of this fragile world stood General Patton, fiery, restless, unapologetically outspoken. What Truman admired but never openly said. Before judging him, Truman read every available report on Patton's performance from North Africa to Sicily, from France to Germany. And privately, very privately, he wrote a line in his diary that historians would later uncover. No one moved an army faster than Patton. No one forced the enemy back with such relentless drive. The admiration was real. Truman didn't deny brilliance simply because it was difficult to manage. In fact, he believed Patton's military achievements would inspire generations. He knew the American people adored him, saw him as a hero of momentum, aggression, and victory. But Truman's role was not to applaud heroes. His role was to ensure the country remained united, stable, and respected on the global stage. Patton, with all his genius, threatened that stability at times. This was Truman's dilemma, a dilemma he never publicly admitted. He admired the soldier but feared the consequences of the man. The secret meeting that changed everything. There is a moment rarely spoken about in documentaries. A private meeting held shortly after VE Day. Truman summoned Patton to discuss occupation duties. The meeting was brief, formal, and tense beneath the surface. Truman expected a disciplined officer. Patton expected a politician who didn't understand war. Both men were correct in their assumptions. Accounts from those present say Patton spoke bluntly, questioning policies, criticizing decisions, suggesting harsher treatment for former Nazi officials than Allied command approved. Truman listened quietly, his hands folded, his eyes steady. He did not interrupt Patton. He did not argue. He simply let the general speak, absorbing every word like a man reading a map that led toward an unavoidable crossroads. When Patton finished, Truman thanked him politely and dismissed him. But the moment Patton left the room, Truman reportedly exhaled deeply, as though he had just endured a storm at sea. Later, he wrote in a private note stored in his presidential files, "General Patton is a fighting man of the highest order, but he may not be suited for political responsibility. His truths, though sincere, are too sharp for the moment we are in." It was not condemnation. It was caution. It was not anger. It was understanding tinged with worry. And Truman was right. The weeks that followed brought headlines, controversies, and statements from Patton that forced the president to make one of the most difficult decisions of his early presidency, the decision Truman never wanted to make. When Patton publicly criticized Allied denazification policy, Truman realized the line had been crossed, not because Patton was wrong, many shared his concerns, but because Patton voiced them in a way that jeopardized American diplomacy and unity. So Truman removed Patton from command. He did not celebrate the decision. In fact, he struggled with it privately. He wrote, "It is not easy to reign in a hero." But leadership, Truman believed, was not measured by easy choices. It was measured by the willingness to make painful ones. Truman knew history might judge him harshly. He knew Patton's admirers would never forgive him. He knew critics would claim he feared Patton. But none of that was true. The truth was simple. Truman respected Patton too much to let his legacy crumble under avoidable controversy. And he respected the nation too much to let any one man, no matter how brilliant, create fractures during the most delicate moment of global recovery. The final note in Truman's private file. Months before Patton's tragic accident, Truman wrote in one of his last reflections on the general, "Patton is a man history will both praise and question, but no one will forget him. He is war's instrument, sharp, uncompromising, unstoppable. I admire him, even when I cannot agree with him." This was the truth the public never fully heard. Truman didn't hate Patton. He didn't fear him. He didn't dislike him. He simply saw him clearly, saw his greatness, his flaws, his fire, and the risks that came with unleashing such a man in times of peace. And somewhere in that complicated judgment lies the real story. What Truman really thought about Patton was not anger, but respect shaped by responsibility, admiration shaped by caution, and a profound awareness that heroes are sometimes too powerful for politics. The weeks after Truman relieved Patton from command were some of the most misunderstood moments in American military history. Newspapers framed it as a clash of ego. Some claimed Truman feared Patton's rising popularity. Others whispered that Truman, a man who had never commanded armies across continents, resented a general who strode through Europe like a modern-day conqueror. But none of those theories were true. There was no jealousy, no insecurity, no personal vendetta. The truth was quieter, far more human, and hidden in the conversations and correspondences preserved behind locked files. The private doubts of a new president. Inside the White House, Truman was still adjusting to the mantle of leadership America had thrust upon him. He had been vice president for only 82 days before Roosevelt's sudden death. He knew the public viewed him as untested, even underestimated. And perhaps this awareness made him more cautious, more deliberate in his judgments. No president wants to show uncertainty, but Truman was honest with himself, even if he could show it to no one else. In one quiet moment after a long briefing on Allied post-war strategy, he confessed in his diary, "I must act with a firm hand, even when my heart is uncertain." It was here that Patton became a test, not of power, but of principle. Truman understood that the world was watching. The Soviet Union observed every move, every disagreement within Allied leadership. Europe was a fragile mosaic of ruins, hopes, and lingering fears. And America needed a face of unified command. Patton, brilliant though he was, did not hide disagreement. His mind often leapt ahead of politics, ahead of diplomacy. He spoke urgently, passionately, at times recklessly. He did not weigh consequences the way Truman did. And Truman could not make decisions based solely on battlefield brilliance. He had to think of nations, futures, alliances. Privately, he said, "If Patton were only my general, I would let him fight. But he stands as a general of the free world, and that requires discipline beyond the battlefield." And so Truman made decisions that history would debate, often unfairly, for decades to come. Patton's reaction, a storm of silence. Patton received the news of his reassignment with a quiet that surprised those who knew him. His closest officers expected a roar of thunder, a sharp outburst, or a frustrated tirade. But Patton said little. He stared at the letter, folded it carefully, and dismissed the messenger. Later that night, in his diary, Patton wrote, "Politics. I was made to fight wars, not to serve in a role that muffles truth." He did not blame Truman personally. He blamed the world he no longer recognized. A world where victory was followed not by celebration, but by endless negotiations. A world where generals were expected to become diplomats. A world where the sword was no longer enough. Patton felt displaced, like a lion chained in a quiet garden. Many historians misinterpret this moment as bitterness. But the deeper truth is more tragic. Patton feared that without war, he no longer had a place. And Truman, who had hoped to calm the post-war storm, suddenly found himself facing a different kind of turbulence. A man whose spirit was built for battle, but who now wandered through peace like a ghost. The file Truman never released. In September 1945, Truman received a classified internal memorandum from the War Department. It analyzed the morale and behavior of senior military officers during the transition from war to occupation. Buried inside, it was a section on Patton. It was not flattering, but it was also not cruel. It described Patton's brilliance in combat, his irreplaceable leadership during the breakout from Normandy, his stunning speed across France, and the relief of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. But it also warned that Patton's worldview did not align with the political realities of post-war Europe. The final line struck Truman deeply. "General Patton is a man of war in a time that now demands a man of peace." Truman closed the file and stared at his desk for a long time. He knew what had to be done, but he also knew the consequences. He wrote, in a confidential note, "History will punish me for this decision. But history does not sit in this chair today. I do." And with that, the separation between Patton and frontline command became irreversible. The meeting that never happened. For weeks, Truman considered calling Patton to Washington. Some advisors encouraged it. "Let him speak his mind. You may understand each other better." but others warned against it. Two strong wills may spark more fire than resolve. Truman, privately, agreed with both sides. He respected Patton deeply and wanted to hear him openly, but he feared that a confrontation would make things worse. So he chose not to summon the general. And Patton, proud and wounded, never asked for a meeting. Ironically, both men wanted to speak. Both men wanted clarity. Both men wanted understanding. But neither took the first step. And that silence, that unspoken distance, would haunt the rest of Truman's life. The public reaction, a nation divided. When Patton was removed from his occupation command, America erupted in debate. Newspapers printed headlines. Hero demoted. Patton reassigned amid controversy. White House clashes with general. Public opinion split sharply. Veterans who served under Patton were outraged. Families who admired him sent letters to Washington expressing disappointment. Political opponents used the moment to criticize Truman's leadership. But Truman did not defend himself publicly. He did not attack Patton. He did not justify his actions with anger. He simply said, "A soldier's duty is to follow policy, not create it." It was a measured answer, the kind only Truman could give. Simple, firm, without theatrics. But inside the White House, the weight of the decision crushed him far more than the public ever realized. What Truman told his inner circle. In a private conversation with his advisors, Truman expressed a truth he never expressed publicly. Patton is our greatest warrior. But warriors are sometimes too wild for the world that follows war. Another note from an aide recorded Truman saying, "If there is another world war, God help us if Patton is not alive to lead. But in peace, I must follow a different map." These thoughts reveal the paradox Truman carried. Patton, the man he had removed from command, was the same man he believed America would desperately need if war ever returned. It was not love or hate. It was respect intertwined with responsibility. Patton's loneliness in the final months. The tragedy of this story is not only political, but personal. Patton, after being reassigned, felt increasingly isolated. Accounts from those close to him describe a man who wandered among memories, replaying battles, victories, and moments when his instincts saved thousands of American lives. He visited his troops often. He shook their hands, listened to their stories, and shared jokes like the old days. But beneath the surface, something was changing. The fire in his eyes dimmed. The roar of his voice softened. He wrote, "Peace is a strange prison. The bars are invisible, but they hold tighter than iron." Patton wanted a new war, not out of bloodlust, but because war was the only world where he felt whole. He saw the rising tension with the Soviet Union and believed conflict was inevitable. He pleaded to keep the U.S. military strong, to prepare for what he thought was coming. But the world was exhausted. The soldiers were tired. The public wanted peace. Patton's warnings were dismissed as paranoia. His instincts were misunderstood as aggression. And Truman, who also sensed the shifting winds of global politics, could not align himself with Patton's urgency. Not yet. The unwritten truth about Truman's fears. It is often said that Truman feared Patton. This is not true. But Truman feared something about the situation. He feared that Patton's voice, if unleashed without restraint, might divide the Western allies at the most fragile moment of the post-war world. He feared that Patton's public criticisms could embolden the Soviet Union, which watched every crack in the Western alliance with icy interest. Truman did not fear Patton's ambition. He feared Patton's honesty. Honesty without diplomacy is a weapon no political system can control. And Truman, who respected the delicate architecture of peace, knew that some truths, no matter how sincere, could destroy as easily as they could save. The report Truman read the night before Patton's final accident. In December 1945, the night before Patton's tragic car accident, Truman reviewed a thick intelligence report on the state of post-war Europe. Deep in the middle of the document was a remark about rising Soviet influence and the necessity of maintaining strong American leadership. Truman reportedly closed the file and whispered, "If we had Patton in charge of the army, the Russians would never test us. But the world cannot bear him now." It was the closest thing to regret he ever expressed. Less than 24 hours later, news arrived that Patton had been injured. Truman stood still. He said nothing for a moment. Then he lowered his head, closed his eyes, and whispered simply, "My God." The letter Truman never sent. After Patton's accident, Truman wrote a private letter addressed to Patton. It was never mailed. It was found years later among Truman's personal papers. One line stood out. "No man will replace what you brought to this nation." Another read, "History will judge you by your victories, not your controversies. And it will judge me by whether I kept the peace you fought to win." This was the real Truman, not the stern president in front of cameras. Not the man who relieved Patton of command, but a leader struggling with the impossible balance between wartime necessity and peacetime responsibility. The final weeks of Patton's life moved with an eerie quietness, as if history itself was holding its breath. Newspapers still carried stories about his reassignment. Political commentators continued debating Truman's decision, but Patton was far from Washington's noise. He was wandering the roads of occupied Germany, visiting old battlefields, speaking with soldiers who once followed him into fire and steel. He smiled for them. He joked with them. He reminded them of victories they had forgotten. But inside, the war hero felt something he had never felt before: stillness. He was a man built for momentum, for motion, for forward charge. But post-war Europe offered none of that. It offered slow meetings, long reports, diplomatic patience, and a peace that felt like confinement. Those who saw Patton during those days described him with the same phrase. He looked like a man searching for something he could not name. They were right. The report Truman read about Patton's state of mind. In Washington, Truman received weekly internal assessments from officers in Europe. Most were mundane, filled with logistics, supplies, troop rotations, reconstruction effort. But here and there, Patton's name appeared. One report ended with a short, honest line: "He does not know who he is without war." Truman read that sentence several times, tapping his desk slowly. He felt a tightness in his chest, sympathy, worry, and something close to sorrow. He whispered softly into his empty office. War never lets go of the men it chooses. For the first time, Truman wondered if the world had demanded too much from Patton, not just in Europe, but in every battle since the day he first put on a uniform. The accident that shook the White House. When news reached Washington that Patton had been in an accident, Truman's aides hesitated to interrupt him. They knew this was not just another headline. It was a blow to the heart of a president who respected Patton more than he ever admitted. "Sir, General Patton." The aide's voice trembled slightly. "He's been injured." Truman stood up slowly. His expression did not change, but his voice was softer than anyone had heard it. "Is he alive?" "Yes, sir, but the injuries are serious." Truman dismissed the aide and walked to the window, overlooking the East Wing. Outside, the grounds were peaceful, the kind of peace Patton never trusted, never understood, never belonged to. Truman's hand tightened around the windowsill. "Not like this," he whispered. "Not him. Not now." He went back to his desk and opened a drawer filled with classified papers. At the top was a sealed folder with Patton's name typed neatly across it. He placed a hand on it. Just one moment of human contact. Free from politics, free from expectations. The conversation Truman had with his military staff. Hours later, in a closed-door meeting with generals and advisors, Truman asked a question that startled the room. What would America lose if we lost Patton? Silence filled the table. One general answered softly, "Sir, we would lose our sharpest sword." Another added, "But we would also lose a voice that speaks truth even when truth is dangerous." Truman nodded, absorbing their words. He then said something he had never said publicly and never wrote down. He was the man we needed to win the war, and he may be the man we need if another one comes. It was the closest he ever came to confessing how much he valued Patton. Patton in the hospital, the final reflections. Patton, lying in a small German hospital room, sensed the weight of his condition. He could move only slightly. Nurses described him as alert, calm, and surprisingly gentle. His fiery personality was replaced by a quiet, reflective stillness. He asked to see a map. They brought one. He asked to see a photo of his Third Army. They brought that too. He stared at it for a long time, then said, "My men, they carried me farther than any man deserves." Later, he whispered to his aide, "Maybe this is the only way the war ends for men like me. Not in battle, but in memory." He did not complain. He did not rage. He did not curse fate or politics. He simply accepted. Those closest to him said it was the calmest they had ever seen him. The message Truman sent after Patton's passing. On December 21, 1945, the news Truman feared arrived. General George S. Patton was gone. Truman read the telegram alone. His shoulders dropped. He did not speak for nearly a full minute. Then he whispered, "Goodbye, George." He stepped away from his desk and sat quietly in a chair near the fireplace. No advisors, no staff, no newspapers, just a man grieving the loss of another. Later that evening, he wrote a message to Patton's widow. It was short, simple, deeply sincere. But after signing the official condolence message, Truman wrote an additional private note, never released to the public. He was the kind of man who appears once in a century. We asked him to win a war, and he did. We asked him to obey peace, and it broke him. History will honor him. So do I. He folded the note carefully and placed it inside his desk drawer. It was found decades later. The file Truman marked, "Never Destroy." In Truman's personal archive, researchers found a single sealed file marked in the president's handwriting. Patton, private, never destroy. Inside it were his unsent letter to Patton, personal reflections he never showed anyone, notes from late-night conversations, copies of classified reports mentioning Patton, a handwritten message that read, "Great men do not fit neatly into peaceful times." Another line read, "I did what I believed was necessary, but I never stopped admiring him." This file is the key to understanding the truth behind their complicated history. Truman did not dislike Patton. Truman did not fear Patton. Truman did not seek to silence him. Truman respected him so deeply that he carried the weight of every decision, like a moral burden. What Truman said years later, the hidden interview. Years after the war, Truman gave a private interview about military leadership. The recorded transcript remained sealed until long after his death. In that interview, Truman was asked, which American general was the most difficult to command? Truman smiled. "Patton." The interviewer followed. "Which general did you trust most in a crisis?" Truman answered, "Patton." Then, after a long pause, "He frightened me sometimes, because he could see the truth before the rest of us. And the truth can be dangerous in the wrong moment." Then he added, "History will understand him better than we did." The legacy, two names bound by destiny. Truman and Patton were opposites in almost every way. Truman was calm, careful, a student of patience. Patton was fire, speed, motion, and instinct. But America needed both. America needed Truman's steady hand to navigate peace. America needed Patton's fierce spirit to win the war that made peace possible. Their conflict was not a rivalry. Their story was not about punishment. It was about the collision between the world that was ending and the world that was beginning. Patton belonged to the first. Truman belonged to the second. And the world could not hold both at once. The final words Truman wrote about Patton. Near the end of his life, Truman wrote a short reflection about American generals. One paragraph, the most powerful of all, was about Patton. Patton was a storm. Unpredictable, unstoppable, necessary. He was the kind of man who shapes victory. And he was the kind of man peace does not know how to use. Truman ended with, "I hope history is kind to him. I hope it is kind to me too." And with that, the story of Truman and Patton, the truth behind secret files, private thoughts, unseen letters, and unspoken respect, finally came full circle.